Today we're going to run through a really quick and easy calculation that you can use in order to determine how much load your frame or structure can take. Or working backwards, let's say you have a very specific load that must be taken, you can use this same equation to determine what type and geometry of material you need to use in your frame or structure. So we'll start with the equation, and then look at where it came from, the derivation, and then finish with an example. So I'm calling this the special equation for bending. And for a pneumatic device, here's how you can remember it. I need to determine what my frame can hold. I need to determine what my frame can hold. I need to determine what my frame can hold. Easy, right? This comes from the equation for bending, which we'll unpack now. Sigma is stress, force per area within a member. M is moment, y is the distance from your neutral axis, and I is your area moment of inertia. So let's break this down. Taking moment again, that's just a force times a distance, or a distance times a force, df. So we're going to replace the moment with distance times force. One way to think of a moment is in the same way you think about a torque. So let's say you have a cross section and you have a force acting tangentially at the outer radius of that cross section. Let's say it's a circular cross section. Then that tangential force multiplied by your radius is your torque. Now a moment is also a force multiplied by a distance, like a radius is a distance. But instead of twisting, you're bending. Y is your distance from the neutral axis. Now, we're not going to dive super deep right now, but basically your neutral axis for a symmetrical cross section is right in the middle. And so typically your highest stresses are at the upper and lower limits of your cross section. And so if y is down the middle of a cross section, then your height of your cross section divided by 2 is where your max stress is going to be, and that's what's interesting to us. So we're going to replace y with h over 2. Now we're going to simplify the equation and divide by the number of sections that share the load, right? So if you have 2 sections sharing the load, then each section will have less stress than if only one section were sharing the load. Here is our special equation for bending again. I need to determine what my frame can hold. So here's an example. I have a customer who has this big earthen oven that's going to be riding on a trailer, and it needs to sit on a frame. It looks something like this. There it is, and there's the frame. And this frame needs to be able to take the weight of the oven. So how do we determine that? Well, we use that equation. So let's look at the top-down view of this frame. Now we can look at this in a couple different ways. A worst case scenario and a more realistic scenario. Worst case scenario is if all of the weight of the oven is right dead center in the frame, right? There's the highest concentration of force right in the middle, being supported by the fewest number of members. Or we could look at a more realistic case where the weight is distributed throughout the entire frame such that it's taken by lots of members. And that's more realistic. But we'll look at both because we want to make sure that our frame can hold even in the worst case condition. So back to our special equation for bending. In this example, what is D? D is just the length of your section. So in this case, we have our force dead center, and it's connected to 4 sections, right? You can see them, they're the ones that cross the dotted red line. Now their length, 10 inches, is D, the distance. Force is just the weight, the load that your frame is taking. In this case, we have a 1,000-pound oven, so F is 1,000 pounds. H is the dimension of your cross section that is parallel to the force. So in this case, we have 1 by 1 square tubing, so H is 1. I is the area moment of inertia. This variable is the capacity for a member to resist bending about a certain axis based on its cross-sectional geometry. I'm going to grab Mechanics of Materials textbook to look at a table for this one. Looking at the rectangle in the table, we can see how our member would be bending about the x-axis. So we're going to look at I sub x. And we're just going to plug in the height and the width as it's shown there in the graphic. So we'll end up with 1 to the 4th over 12 minus 0.81 to the 4th over 12. And 0.81 is just the width of the square tubing minus the wall thickness. That ends up being 0.0475 inches to the 4th, your area moment of inertia. Now, N is your number of segments. How many segments are resisting that force? In the case from earlier, it's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Simple enough. And that's it. Those are all our variables. And so now we can solve for the internal stress. We get 26,300 pounds per square inch, PSI. In this worst case, we have 10-inch segments, and there are 4 of them. In our more likely scenario, in our best case scenario, we have 5-inch segments, and there are 12 of them. Plugging those values into the same equation, we end up with an internal stress of 4,400 psi, much less. So what do we do with these numbers? We compare them to the yield strength of the material that our frame or structure is made out of. For example, our frame is made out of A36 hot rolled steel. So looking at the same book, we can see how for A36 steel, our yield strength is 36 KSI, or 36,000 PSI. Alright, so we got 26,300 PSI, and then we got 4,400 PSI. Okay, so the yield strength is 36,000. Let's look at the best case. The factor of safety, which is the yield over the best case scenario in this case, is 8.2. That means for the best case scenario, this frame is 8.2 times stronger than it has to be. We're good. Let's look at the worst case. So 36,000 yield over 26,300, and we get 1.4. Good enough for a worst case. So the frame looks good. And that's it. We did it. Nice work. Quick point of clarification. This equation we just went through is not advice for professional engineers. If you are designing a bridge or anything such that if it fails, it might hurt someone, then go through much more thorough calculations. This equation is just for folks in their garage, small farmers, small producers who have a wooden frame or a steel weldment and are just thinking, I need to determine what my frame can hold.